Hey everyone, my name is Dennis. I am the founder at Six Nomads. I hope really soon Ksenia will join me, my co-founder. And we decided to run a remote conference today, and I believe everyone of you already tired of webinars and the things like that when just everyone listen to the panelists. So I'm highly ask you to turn on your videos and turn on your mix when it's needed. So it's better to see your faces. We can see Sacha here. Sacha is our first speaker today. But before Sacha will start, can you please turn on the videos and just say hi? And if you say, where are you now, and introduce yourself, it would be really great. So I'm currently in Moscow, Russia. So Sacha, I believe she's in California, is it correct?
I'm actually in Philadelphia. So I'm on the East Coast of the United States. I used to work and live in San Francisco, California, but I'm in Philadelphia. Okay. Hi, everybody.
Yes. Hi. So I believe it's 8 hours difference or so between us. But before we start, we have a couple of minutes before Sacha presentation. I want to say a few words about Six Nomads. So Six Nomads is a product to hire remote developers, like software engineers. We believe that the talent is split equally, but opportunities are not, and there is no need to fish in a small pond if you can fish in a big one. So, at the other hand, we see that when you hire remotely, the job boards, it's not the best place to hire engineers. So we decided to reimagine the process of hiring like remote engineers. And now if you're an employee, you can go through the vetting process. It's 3 stages of assessment and get the list of the, I would say, offers or companies who are not present on the job board. So it's quite pre-vetted list of companies. And if you're on the employer side, you will get the engineers and software developers who are not spending time on job boards. So basically we give access the best companies to the best people possible from overseas. So that's our mission. And we conduct, it's the first event it's the first remote conference for us. And also we run remote stand-ups. We try to run it like every Tuesday. Lola, can you please share the link to everyone? So, and we invite the founders of remote startups and the leaders, the investors, and they share their knowledge. We don't record those sessions. So I would say it's a closed community where you can just get insights, how to raise money if you're a founder, how to build the product if you're a remote founder as well, how to hire people. We don't record those sessions because we just try to be as honest and as possible and answer like even really difficult questions. Okay, so let's start with Sacha. Sacha, can you just give us a perspective about your background? What do you do before we start with the actual presentation?
Sure. So actually in my presentation, I talk a little bit about my background. So I can pull up some stuff. I like to show some visuals and I can tell you kind of where I'm coming. Yes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you about 20 minutes or less of content. And I do want to have questions from you. So I'm getting my screen all ready right now. Can everybody hear me okay? We good? Thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay. Can everybody see one slide that says the 4 must-know skill areas to be an effective virtual leader? Okay, we're off to a good start. All right, so what I want you to get out of our time together today is I want you to be aware of some key virtual leadership concepts. So I'm going to talk to you about a concept called distance bias, and I'm going to give you some explanation of what that is in a minute. And I want you to be ready. I want you to know what these 4 must-have skill areas are to be an effective virtual leader. And I want you to be change agents. I want to give you a couple of tactics that you can take back to your teams and use them as you're working across distance with your teams. So let's start out with, this is not normal remote work, what's happening right now. It's not normal remote work. I've been a 10-year remote worker And normal remote work should be a seamless environment. It should feel seamless to whoever it is that you're interacting with. You'll see in a second, like a big part of my career working remotely was working with in a large company that many people were co-located together and I was remote. But what's happening right now is extreme work-life integration. So we've got, for those of us who might be parents in the audience, does anybody have kids at home with them right now? I'm looking to see if got people with kids at home. A couple. Okay. Right. For me, I have 2 kids at home. I'm supposed to also be helping them with school. My husband and I are supposed to be helping them with school in the house while also working. Because we're in a pandemic, we might also be responsible for helping some of our family members who need to be taken care of. There might be people in our households that are sick or ill. So we need to remember as managers within our organization, or if you're working with clients, for example, that there is a lot going on outside of what you can see on the screen when you're videoing in with someone. So we have to be really empathetic right now to the fact that we're juggling a lot. So I start off with this to say that I understand if maybe a kid comes into the frame as I'm talking today and sits on your lap, or if you have a pet that's making noise in the background. This is a whole new frontier that we're now figuring out as we go in this remote work. So as Dennis asked, what's my background? So you can kind of understand where I'm coming from here. So actually I'm a marketer by trade. So I spent 18 years working in marketing. So I worked for advertising agencies first. So these are 2 names of agencies here in the United States. And then I spent 14 years working for the Clorox company. So the Clorox company is a multinational company. Majority of our sales are here in the US. It's a $6 billion company. Is anybody familiar with Clorox? So Clorox bleach, Clorox disinfecting wipes, etc. So I spent 14 years there working in marketing, sales, new product innovation. And of those 14 years, I actually worked fully remotely for 8 of them. So about 2 years ago, I left to start my own company to help teach the skills to lead and communicate and collaborate across distance. And so I've been working with many different companies and teams across many different industries, from the car industry to consumer packaged goods to healthcare, to help them during this time, pre-COVID and now during the pandemic, on how to now work in this virtual environment, because many of us were so used to being co-located, at least with part of our team. Or many of us, if you're in sales, we're very used to being able to have an in-person relationship with our clients or our new business prospects. So I went remote back in 2010. So I was living in San Francisco at first, working for Clorox, the $6 billion company. I was working from their headquarters. And in 2010, I decided to move to Philadelphia. So in the United States, that's the other coast. So I moved from West Coast to East Coast, so 3,000 miles away. And I was an experiment. I was one of the very first people to work fully remotely for this company. Experiment here. So I had to relearn how to do everything from a distance. And so this is a picture of one of the last teams that I led at Clorox. It was a team that was responsible for $250 million worth of sales. And it was a team that was many people co-located together in the headquarters office, but also other people who were located in different parts of the United States. And again, me in Philadelphia. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, it was important before the pandemic, is important right now, and will continue to be important into the future, because organizations are now kind of figuring out what is that right balance of working fully remotely or working in a hybrid or virtual environment. So pre-pandemic, a lot of organizations were in this bucket in here in the middle. They were called geographically distributed or hybrid or virtual organizations. So geographically distributed, meaning you have a headquarters in one area, maybe some satellite offices. Hybrid, meaning you have some offices, but people who are also fully remote. But the pandemic, at least in the US, caused a lot of these organizations to overnight shift into a frog, a fully remote organization. And I would never tell an organization to jump into being a frog without having skills, processes, policies in place in order to enable that. But that's where we're finding ourselves right now, is that really rapid transition to figuring out how to work in this frog environment. And as time goes, and depending on what's going on with your country in terms of the pandemic right now, you might start seeing this fluidity back and forth. So maybe some offices are opening back up, where some people are coming back into an office, but some people are still staying fully remote. So I foresee the future being a hybrid future where the majority of large organizations will have office sites still, but we'll continue to have some people who are either working part-time remotely or fully remotely. And that's why these leadership skills are so important, not just now, but into the future. So before I get into those leadership skills, I want you to have awareness of 2 unconscious biases that we need to be aware of that are playing against us when we are working in these virtual, hybrid, or fully remote organizations. So the first one is called distance bias. This is something that the Neuro Leadership Institute has proven, and it's part of their unconscious bias model. So distance bias is our brain's natural tendency to put more importance on the people and the things that are closer to us than there's those that are further away. So where this pops up a lot is when you have people who are co-located together in an office building in one place, and then you have other people that are in the location minority who are either working fully remotely or working from a smaller office somewhere else. And this distance bias comes up. So the big group of people that are co-located oftentimes are thinking more top of mind of the people that are nearer to them. Has anybody experienced this distance bias, where there's more value put on the people that are actually sitting together and near each other? No?
Yes, we have started Six Nomads as an office company, and then we decided to go remote. And that was it's a huge problem.
Yes, and so this distance bias comes up, especially when you have office buildings. But what a lot of people might be feeling right now, if you're in a frog or fully remote organization, is something called recency bias, which means your brain is putting more value on the people that you have heard from or seen more recently. So, for example, if you're managing a team of people, you might find yourself thinking more about the last 2 or 3 people who sent you an email or a message on Slack or did a video conference with you. And you might have forgotten about part of your team that might be a little bit more quiet. And this is something that, as a manager, if you're managing people, you need to be really aware of. And you need to create ways to overcome that, so that everybody, regardless of their location and regardless of how quiet they are or not, stays at equal with you. Okay, so these are the 2 concepts that I just want you to know of, these unconscious biases, something that our brain is doing. And here's my virtual leadership success framework. So these 4 key areas to be a successful virtual leader. And when I say leader, I don't mean that you have to have a fancy title or you have to have a lot of people reporting into you. When I say leader, we are all leaders. We are all responsible for coming up with new ideas for our companies. We are all responsible for...
We are all responsible for coming up with new idea.
Hello, hi. Exactly what I was saying earlier. We have somebody joining us who has a buddy with them. Kensia, could you maybe or Xenia, oh, that's no problem. No problem. Just we'll make sure we mute people as that happens. No problem. All right, so back to being a leader. So we're all responsible for leadership within our teams, within our organizations. So I don't want you looking at this and saying, this doesn't apply to me because I don't have a fancy title or people reporting into me. So these 4 areas, oftentimes organizations come to me and they would say, what are the technology tools that we need to work in a virtual team? And I always have them stop and take a step back. And the tech tools are important. You need to have the right tools and everybody needs to know how to use them. But these other 3 areas are actually even more important. And that's what today I'm going to quickly go over each of these other 3 areas to give you a sampling of that. So we're going to talk about expectation setting, relationship building and culture building, and some of these virtual skills. What are the skills that we were used to doing as in-person teams that we now need to do and take account the distance between us? So let's start with expectation setting. So many of you are probably feeling this right now: video meeting fatigue and communication overload. So I'm hearing this across my clients, across all industries, that it's back-to-back meetings. We're having Zoom fatigue of being on video calls, and we're getting so many emails, or we're getting so pinged and dinged with all different types of communication, right? Our Slack messages, or emails, whatever other tool that you're using. And so it's really important that within your teams, you take a step back and talk about the expectations for your team in terms of what are the communication norms that you want to set for your team. What tools do you want to use for what reasons, for example, getting really clear on that. And as you're doing that, you want to have a conversation around communication in these 2 buckets. Synchronous communication, meaning live communication, expecting real-time response. So this is synchronous right now. We're all together live here. It's being recorded so that later it can be asynchronous, meaning not live, that people can watch it later. But you want to have a balance of that synchronous and asynchronous. Asynchronous meaning not real time. So emails, for example, are another example of not real time. What I find happening in a lot of organizations that were not used to working in a virtual atmosphere is that they're relying way too much on synchronous communication, because that's what they were used to in the office. They were used to showing up in the office, spending all day together, live communication, and then going home. So think about how you're communicating within your teams, and do you need to have a better balance of these? This is especially important as you're working across different time zones. So I love the fact that today we have people from all over the world in different time zones, and I would imagine many of your teams are across different time zones. So when you're having these conversations with your teams about these communication norms or these expectations, you might also want to have a conversation around setting some boundaries. So I started off the conversation around this is not normal remote work. For many of us, we're having to also juggle things in our personal lives that we normally wouldn't have to during the workday. So to help people with some boundaries and to avoid burnout, because we want to avoid the burnout here, because that will make it even harder. If people are burning out, that will make it even harder to get to your business objectives. You want to have a conversation about things like core meeting hours. What are the times when we expect everybody to be available for live meetings, especially across time zones? Or what do you expect in terms of responsiveness? So do you expect that if you send an email at 10 p.m. at night that somebody's going to respond? I hope that the answer is no, and that you could say, if I send an email in late at night, that I do not expect a response until it's working hours for you the next day. So my point in bringing this up, all of this is in that blue box we talked about, expectation setting, is that you need to be really intentional, really strategic about setting those expectations with your team. The next section I want to talk about is the virtual skills. So I'm going to pop into the chat here. Let's see here. If I can do this, yes, everyone, I'm going to pop into the chat a link on my website that you can go and you can download a free resource. Part of this resource has a very simple skills assessment. These top 10 areas of crucial and critical skills to be a successful virtual leader. And you can use this to self-assess, to assess just you, or you could use it with your team to see who feels comfortable in some of these skill areas and who needs help. Because if you identify somebody who's an expert in your team in one of these areas, they could actually teach that skill to your team. Or if you find an area that a lot of people are not feeling comfortable with, you might want to consider bringing somebody in to help teach your team. So you can see on this list, there are things like leading effective and efficient virtual meetings, because those meetings are different than when we huddle all together in a room. Influencing across distance. This is actually what I think is the most important skill, and a skill that people don't realize until they've been working remotely for a while that they need to have. So it's about thinking about, how do you influence other people with your thinking? How do you get them to decide on something in your favor when you can't run into them in an office setting? And it's especially important right now as most organizations are working as frogs or fully remote organizations. And then there are things like, how do you manage a direct report who's not sitting next to you, or how do you work with a manager that's remote? So I won't go through all of these right now, but there is that resource for you that I put the link in the chat, so you can find that there. While we're together today, I wanted to give you something really tactical, something you could go use. So let's talk about something specific to virtual meetings, because I'm sure all of us are responsible for facilitating virtual meetings. So the first thing that I want to start with is back to that synchronous and asynchronous idea we just talked about, is before you send an invite for a meeting, I want you to first ask yourself, do we really need a live meeting for this? That's usually people just, put the meeting on the calendar and then figure it out as they go. But many of the things that you're probably setting up meetings for could be handled in a different way. Maybe they could be handled through Slack. Maybe they could be handled through email. Maybe they could be handled through a Google document where people can comment asynchronously or not live. So first, I beg of you all to first think, do I really need a meeting, or is there another way I could get to my outcome? If you say, yes, I still need a meeting, here's another tool for you. It's this 5 Ps framework. And again, on the download from my website, this framework is there as well. So you don't have to take the notes if you don't want to. And it's how to build a good agenda prior to the meeting to make sure that you have a really efficient, effective, engaging, and inclusive meeting. Those are kind of the 4 key areas to have a really successful meeting. And usually people get the first part down, the purpose, like why are we meeting? That usually people kind of have that figured out. But where people usually don't think this level of detail is, what is the product of the meeting? What is the specific intended outcome of the meeting? So for example, if I was leading a meeting where we were, the purpose was to finalize a timeline for a project. To get really specific, the product of the meeting should be, we will end the meeting when we have a completed timeline and we have identified the top 2 risk areas for the timeline. So really specific on what we're trying to achieve. Then from there, the next 3 Ps will flow. So process. How are you going to actually facilitate that discussion to get to a decision? So if your team was used to huddling together in a conference room and putting sticky notes on the wall, how are you going to do that in a virtual environment? Do you need to use a new software tool like Mural, for example? Or how are you going to do this? So thinking through the process, thinking through the pre-work. So maybe you can assign some work to be done asynchronously, meaning not live, that people can do ahead of time so that you spend a shorter amount of time together live. And the last thing is thinking about the people that you invite. Trying to have a small group of the right people. Oftentimes we like to be inclusive, so we invite lots of people, but really we should be inviting the people who are adding the most value to the meeting. The other people who are not adding value to the meeting, they can read the meeting notes later. So this is one tool, again, it's on the download from my website that you could start to use to create an agenda for all of your meetings. I think it's really important to have these agendas ahead of time for the meeting so people can come prepared. They know what value they can add. They know what value they are getting out of the meeting. So I'm going to give you one more skill area with some tactical tips, and then we're going to pause for questions. So if you want to start populating some questions in the chat right now, you can. And when I finish this section, also, we can take live questions if you want to come off of mute then as well. So this last area, this yellow box, relationship building and culture building. So I want us to all get on the same page in terms of what do we mean by culture? Because oftentimes I hear people say that team culture is the same as having virtual happy hours and doing those fun activities. Well, having fun is part of your team culture. But really what team culture is, it's the values, beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors shared by a team. It's how people work together toward a common goal, how they treat each other. And different teams can have different cultures within the same company. If you have a large company, like I worked for that $6 billion company, you have some company values and a company culture. But the team that I led, I showed you that picture, the team that I led, we had to then figure out what was our own team culture within that kind of bigger umbrella of the company. And what's interesting about this is that when you're working in a virtual team, when you're not all co-located together, it can be very hard to know what the culture is of the team because you have these like virtual curtains between you where you only get little peeks into this, depending on whether you are reading into a digital communication like email or Slack, or a little peek when you have a meeting and you see how people are behaving and treating each other. So what to do about this? So I do a whole workshop on building culture in distributed teams, but part of that workshop is setting some of these foundational building blocks, is to think about, have we established our team values? And if not, we need to have a discussion to actually establish them, make them public, recognize and reinforce them. Also, have we established team goals? So not just individual goals, but are we sure that cross-functionally we're all aligned to the same goals on the team? And lastly, the operating principles. So back to expectation setting. Have we defined what these expectations are for our teams, and have we made that public and transparent? So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with GitLab. GitLab is a great standard to look at their employee handbook, for example, in terms of how they make their operating principles, their values, their culture really accessible and searchable through their online handbook. All right, so this is where I'm going to pause for the questions. I put up on here all of my contact information in the case that you want to reach out to me, in case you have the need for a workshop for your team. I do workshops everywhere from how to lead effective virtual meetings to how to manage direct reports that are remote, to how to influence and how to build culture. And then here are the social media channels and other ways to connect with me. All right, so Dennis, would you prefer me to use the chat and use the questions off the chat, or how do you want to run this?
Yes, can I ask the first question, and then please just turn on the video and ask the question, and please don't interrupt each other, just one, and let's have just 10 minutes for questions and go forward to that, okay? So my first question is, as I see, there are like more and more open positions called head of remote. It's basically the leader of the remote team, and I've seen the position, that kind of position at Facebook, I believe any other companies as well. And what do you think? What is the person head of remote? What is the responsibility of that person? Is it technical person or more managerial person, or what is it's difficult to understand basically, because most of the companies who hire head of the remote, it's an IT companies, but I don't understand what is the main responsibilities of that kind of person. And do you see the future of, it's a new position for the world, as I see it wasn't on scene like for like, I believe the only company has that position like 5 years ago, it was GitLab, or I don't know. So, but now it's really common. Can you say a few words about that, please?
Sure. So when I was at Clorox, and I told you I was working remotely for them for 8 years, toward the end of my career there, I had been already helping the Clorox community of employees work better together across distance in my spare time. I was running a business and I was leading what's called an employee resource group. That was the first of its kind, a virtual workforce employee resource group to help the company work better across the different office sites. And 2 years ago, I created a role description for myself that said that I wanted to be responsible for helping the organization adapt to the future of work, to help with the collaboration across distance. I didn't know what to call it though. I just knew there was a need there, but I didn't know what to call it. I think I called it something like Director of Corporate Collaboration. And Clorox at the time, they said, I don't know if that's necessary. You know, we don't need a full-time position for that. No, thank you. And then what I started to see is, like you mentioned, GitLab. A couple months after that, I think GitLab created a head of remote. I think Twitter might have a head of remote that's also in charge of a couple of other things. There are these heads of remote. Maybe I think Prezi has one as well in the tech industry, as you said, Dennis, in the tech industry. I actually think for the majority of organizations, they need a head of hybrid, not a head of remote, a head of hybrid. Because as we mentioned earlier, with that spectrum of remoteness, it's actually most companies are going to have some office sites and some fully remote employees or partially remote employees. And your question about what is the role of that person? Well, I think that the head of hybrid role that should be created, I think what that role should be responsible for is a couple of things. I think that they should be responsible for overseeing the workplace and workforce strategy. So they should be at the table. It should be somebody senior at the table who can help think more broadly about how are the different office sites going to interact with each other. Are we going to have a hub system? Are we going to have one headquarters and everybody else remote? Thinking about that strategy. And then they also need to be responsible for the strategy and execution of things like skills development. How do we make sure everybody has the virtual leadership skills like we were talking about today to be able to work across distance in these hybrid teams? They need to be aware of diversity and inclusion. So I talk a lot about location diversity and inclusion. So making sure that the plans are put in place to overcome those unconscious biases I told you about. They need to be responsible for having diversity and inclusion programs and strategies in place to overcome distance bias, recency bias, because of people being in all these different locations. So it's, in my opinion, it's a role that doesn't exist yet, head of hybrid, and it's a very strategic role that has to oversee strategy and also the execution.
Thank you very much. So I see other questions in the chat. Do everyone want to ask the question like publicly with a video? Does anyone has the questions to Sasha?
Hi, Sasha, this is Jill. How are you? I don't know if my video is working or not. I was having some issues, but I know my voice works. One of the questions actually is for this, when you set up these meetings and you're from a culture of very inclusion, how do you politely start excluding and change that bigger company culture to have the meetings more focused when they have to be remote?
Yes. So first of all, Jill and I used to work together at Clorox. I can recognize the voice. Hi, Jill.
Hi.
And so Jill, you're asking about how to reduce the invite list when we're used to being, yes. Okay.
Yes.
Yes, that comes up often. So I would suggest for the first time when you're going to reduce the invite list that you actually reach out to the people that you are considering disinviting before you just send an invite and don't include them, and have a conversation around why you are not including them in the invitation any longer. So for example, what I see oftentimes in consumer packaged goods companies like Clorox, what sometimes can happen is you end up inviting your peer and then also their boss. So you're like doubling up across different functions, sales, marketing, whatever. And so you have these layers. And so getting really clear about who should be there. Should it be your peer? Should it be their boss? Who has the decision-making rights, or who's the one who should be inputting? Sometimes you will hear from your marketing counterpart, for example, yes, I as the brand manager want to be there, but I also want my associate marketing manager there because it's a training opportunity for them. Well, in that case, you then know what the roles are. You know that person is there just as a training opportunity. And okay, maybe you would say for a couple of the meetings that makes sense. Then if somebody is fighting you on why they want to be there, even though you don't think that they are adding value, I think it's getting clear from them on what value they think that they will be adding and why it's important for them to be there instead of just reading the notes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Sacha, this is Luis. I wanted to ask you about companies that didn't used to work remote before the pandemic, and after the pandemic, they been forced to do it. So what are the suggestions for them to feel welcome new remote workers after the pandemic? And after that, the second question is, how do you as a company help them to build meaningful relationships on things that they don't know yet?
Yes, this is hard. It's hard to start as a fully remote employee in a new company during a pandemic. So I'm glad you're asking that question. And I think that back to those 4 boxes that I shared with you on the screen before, that yellow box, right? That relationship building, that culture building. Usually that happens, it gets kickstarted when we are together, but we don't have that opportunity. So you need to think through a couple of things. One is, how do you start to form those relationships? Video helps. So being on video, being able to see each other, starting to feel like a connection across the distance. Pairing that person up with other people in the organization to do virtual coffee chats is one way for them to also get to start to network within the organization. The workshop that I do on influencing across distance, one of the first steps in that workshop is to do a stakeholder map, which means to map out all the people that you need to influence up, down, and across the organization. That exercise is actually really helpful for the manager of the new person to actually do with the new hire, because the new hire will not understand kind of how everything's working, who they need to be communicating with inside the company, outside the company. And so to sketch that out for the person can provide much needed context. And the last thing I'll say on that too is to develop those relationships again. I do a couple of tools. So one is kind of a one pager. I have everybody on my team create a one page about them, their style, a little bit about their background, what their personal values are, and can share that live with the organization, or asynchronously can post that to a shared drive, a shared folder, people that can have access to it. Or they could even present themselves on a video. So use Loom or different recording software and have them do a little welcome video of themselves, and have the rest of the team also do a welcome video for them.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, it's Jay. We have
Hi.
time for one more question. Yeah, hi. So I've been working remotely, but I'm not too familiar with, working with a bigger organization or a bigger corporation for like as an employee remotely. I'm just curious, do you know if there's any kind of like trend, or if there's any requirement for employees of larger remote employees of larger companies to install like surveillance on their computer? And if so, like what's the percentage rate of how many people or how many companies are utilizing this kind of software to monitor employees? How prevalent is it, or if it's optional, not optional, or do people have the option to use this kind of software or not? Just curious.
Sure. Can I ask you why you're asking? Because that'll help me with my answer.
Well, I mean, I've only worked in office at corporations. So I never worked remotely full time for another company. So I'm just, if I decide to pursue that route to work full time remotely for a bigger corporation, I'd wonder if I have to be prepared for that kind of conversation or that kind of issue that might arise.
Yes. So I think it's very company specific. It's industry specific. If anybody were asking me my point of view on it, I would suggest not doing that. I feel, one of my values is to start from a place of trust. One of my values is to know that everybody is trying to do their best in the role that they've been assigned to do within the company. And in order to track productivity, I think a better way to do that is through a performance management process, which would include having really specific performance objectives from the beginning, and a cadence and a regular check-in on how you're doing against those performance objectives throughout the year. So I can't answer your question in terms of the percentages of companies that are doing this or not doing this, but I can say that I don't think it should be the best practice to do this. I think instead there should be a broader performance management process.
Thank you very much, Sacha. Thank you very much for coming.